Welcome to this BPF webinar on It's a Small World, Lessons from Around the Globe. I'm Damien Wild, Editor-in-Chief of EG. I'm in London, but I'm joined by a panel of experts from around the world for this session. Now, most of the conversations I've seen on life after COVID-19 have been national affairs, but the more our outlook shrinks, the less likely we are to solve what is a shared crisis. So in an effort to put that right, this next hour will be global. Global speakers and global questions. Retail has been one of the hardest hit sectors. And despite this, many, including some governments, fail to see the sector as part of the solution. So by bringing together global real estate leaders today to share experiences and their outlook on the future, I hope that will speed up this recovery and show that this sector has a part to play in getting us back to a better place. So I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Brooks, CEO of Canada's National Industry Association, REALPAC, Melanie Leech, Chief Executive of the British Property Federation, Dominique Moerenhout, CEO of the European Public Real Estate Association, Ken Morrison, Chief Executive of the Property Council of Australia, Steve Wechsler, President and CEO of the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts in the US, of course, and Sigrid Zeil-Sita, CEO of the Asia Pacific Real Estate Association. So I'll begin by asking each of you, I'll begin by welcoming you, of course, and thanking you for joining us, but then I'll begin by asking each of you just to give us a brief outlook on how things are going in your region, generally and specifically for real estate. Michael, can I start with you?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me, and hello to everybody in the UK. Give you a bit of context on Canada, 38 million people. We have 62,000 cases, 27,000 recovered, and 4,000 deaths. We're probably amongst the better of countries around the world. We flattened the curve. We've pretty much closed the border with the US for the time being. So I think most governments believe we've slowed or flattened the curve, and we're now starting to see selective governments reopening their economies coast to coast. It's going to be slow, and it will be based on phases depending on what the flare-ups look like. If I were to rank the impact on the various sectors, by far hotel is the worst, literally fallen off an economic cliff, single-digit occupancies if they're open. In fact, many of the hotel operators are actually looking to do charitable things with local hospitals, provide accommodation for frontline workers, that kind of thing. Retail would be the second hardest hit in our economy, and I would segregate that into malls, which are, they have 20 to 50% revenue collections in April, so very hard hit. And maybe the best of retail would be food anchored retail, and maybe they're at 70 or 80% rent collections in April. Yeah, the grocery store is paying the rent, but the other inline stores maybe aren't. The other four categories, apartments, office, industrial, seniors, are actually doing very well. They 95% rent collections or higher. I would say that the further damage to all those sectors depends on how long this lockdown lasts and how quickly we get back to normal. Okay, but there are some positive stories there, and as you say, there's the hotels. Have you seen a positive response for the industry from this industry to embracing that broader need to contribute? Absolutely. In fact, we had a major conference call of the 5 local associations in the Greater Toronto area yesterday, it's amazing how people will step up in a crisis. Donations of money, donations of cleaning staff that are furloughed from the hotel sector, personal protective equipment, making parking available for frontline workers, making hotel rooms available for frontline workers so they don't have to take transit home, and so they don't have to go back to their families and potentially reinfect them. So it's been really heartwarming to see the industry step up coast to coast to get involved. Okay, that's great to hear, and I'm sure there's similar stories around the world. Dominique, I'll move on to you next. Yep. What's the position in Europe?
Yeah, I would say just a quick comment on what Mike just mentioned about the initiatives taken by the sector in Canada. So we do have exactly the same with the listed REITs in Europe, where they've been bringing huge short and long-term contributions to communities in their fight against COVID-19. by also making some space available for the most vulnerable, repurposing some vacant space, providing food hubs and delivery to sick and elderly, distributing masks, creating charity funds, etc., etc. So that's of course a very huge contribution. Maybe just to put things into context, to my opinion, because I hear when you have called people comparing the crisis now with the global financial crisis in 2008, I think we are experiencing a totally different type of crisis. 2008 was both a solvency and the liquidity crisis, whilst the 2020 crisis has been triggered by the near total shutdown in cash flows to many businesses. So it's a liquidity crisis today. Solvency has been solved in between. So of course we have daily contacts with our members, property companies and investors. What our members have been mainly dealing with and what have been the challenges over the last 2 months is, first of all, it's what I would say the daily operational asset management of their portfolio. It has become today a 24/7 business. And the issues really vary from the one sector to the other. And it's even more important in Europe when the REITs have a pan-European business, because the confinement and the lockdown measures vary from the one country to the other. Of course, they've been also dealing a lot with this very complicated issue, and I'm sure you will come back to that a bit later during the call, the issue related to the fall-off space rent debate and also lease renegotiations. What we have seen in Europe, and Melanie can of course even contribute on the UK side from that, is that REITs have immediately implemented adequate measures towards their most vulnerable tenants. And this is something which is very important. And what I see on the market today, which I find very irritating, is twofold. It's first of all, is I have the feeling that sometimes there is a perception that the real estate is nothing else than nasty landlords collecting rents from the poor little tenants. And of course, we all know this is not the truth. This is the first thing. The second thing, which is even more irritating to a sector, is that we see large international and very wealthy corporates trying to benefit from the current situation to renegotiate their lease conditions with the tenants. So we know those multinationals are very wealthy, financially in a very good position, etc. It's also important to remind that a lease contract is a contract that has been signed originally between two consenting parties. It's like a wedding contract. So it's good also to remind that. Of course, when we say liquidity crisis, our members are, of course, daily managing their balance sheet and the liquidity by putting in place some very drastic measures, like some of them cutting dividends, postponing non-essential capex expenditures in their portfolio. But again, liquidity today for members is much better than where it was in 2008. Lower LTV, longer debt maturity, lower financing conditions, but also they have a substantial undrawn capital so far. So liquidity is very under scrutiny, but we are in a far better position today than where the sector was in 2008. Of course, the members, together with the associations, with Melanie in the UK, with EPRA at the pan-European level, so they've been raising their voice towards national and European governments and banks to get their support to help the tenants, but also the landlords. And it's definitely clear that the banks will have a huge role to play in solving this crisis. Dealing also on a daily basis with big issues. Valuation is something which comes all the time on the table. How can you perfectly evaluate a building today when you don't have access to the building, when you don't have comparison funds because there is a weaker demand market, there is almost nothing happening on the investment market. So this is important. Development projects have been put on hold. Now some of them start coming back to the norm in Europe. But it has, of course, an impact from a cash flow perspective, but also from a delivery towards occupier in the short and medium term. And then also something which we are liaising with many of the people on the screen here today in the webinar is the lease accounting issue, which is linked to the rent concessions, because the IASB is pushing to put in place some measures which might benefit the lessee and not the lessor. And some of the organizations on the call today are dealing with that for the moment.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Very comprehensive answer. I'll come back to some of those points. I'll bring in Melanie at the end and we'll talk more about that nasty landlord perception. But we talked about liquidity there. And I wonder whether what we've seen in the UK in the last couple of weeks around equity raising, whether that's happening on continental Europe as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So what you experience in the UK is exactly mirrored in Europe. Even if the UK is not part of the European Union anymore, the UK is still part of Europe. And we are representing the UK even more today and tomorrow than in the past.
Pleased to hear it.
Yeah.
Okay, Ken, what's the view from Australia?
So from a health perspective, Australia is actually not going too badly. We've got about 900 current cases for a population of 25 million and just 62 people in hospital at the moment. So, you know, from our suppression strategy that governments have led has been quite successful, which is very pleasing. On Friday here, our national government will start announcing a timetable to reopen parts of the economy. So that's a little bit scary, I've got to say, because Sigrid will talk in a little bit. We have seen other places where governments have thought they had this virus under control and it's got away from them. So hopefully that won't happen here in Australia. But there's a lot of focus now turning to how we stimulate the economy. This has been an incredible and rapid shock to the economy, and of course it's a synchronized global event, so that makes it so much worse. So, governments here have been inviting ideas. We've been talking to members about what should be done, what we should be putting forward, and been having those discussions with government. You know, for us, a lot of those issues, well, there's a number of issues. There's things that we're saying need to be done to stimulate demand, to help construction, and particularly housing construction. We have this sort of demand falling off a cliff in terms of housing construction, a lot of jobs there. So if that activity can be a driver of economic recovery, then that can be quite powerful. There's a need to fast track public and private projects, infrastructure, and also, you know, private projects, whether commercial or residential, particularly those that can be quite a catalyst for further investment down the track. We've been sitting at the edge in Australia of comprehensive tax reform for about 10 years. So there's a cohort of business groups which are quite keen to see governments finally grasp the mantle and do some things which as a country we've known we should be doing for quite some time. So some of those things as well. And then two other things which I think are really quite important for this call is, I think, you know, as we're seeing in major democracies around the world, where there's this big debate about whether does this virus and the effects of this virus mean that actually globalization was the wrong idea? You know, should we have open capital flows? Is that something that we should do or not? So the voices of protectionism are growing, and so one of the things we're also at pains to say is, you know, one of the secret sources of Australia are open capital flows, utilising the world's best capital to create the real estate and the infrastructure this country needs to be productive and to have a great lifestyle, but also the talent. So, one of the amazing things that's occurred here is that Australia's population is actually going to shrink for the first time in generations, and it's actually been, you know, population growth and not just aggregate growth, but the fact that we have a migration program which bends very sharply to a strong skills migration means that we have a strong, not just growth driver, but a productivity driver in our country. And for the moment, that's been switched off. So, you know, we're also saying we need to get back and start normalising that growth driver for the country and that productivity driver for the country which is all about people, and that we'll have to be doing that in a COVID-19 world.
Okay, interesting. You talked about being on the cusp of tax reform for some time there. What are some headline examples of that, briefly?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple of things. There's those tax settings which are really about overall economic growth for the country. So, for example, our corporate tax rate is much higher than many comparable OECD countries, and that's an increasingly disadvantaged competitive position to be in. We have a consumption tax, but it's just set at 10%, so and has quite a lot of exemptions. So there's a capacity to utilise that more and perhaps rely less on other forms of taxation. And of course, in impacting real estate, we have stamp duty, which is levied on transactions, which in any economic analysis always comes right at the most inefficient end. So for every dollar of tax raised through transfer stamp duty, about 72% of harm to the economy is done. So it's a crazy tax, which inconveniently raises a lot of money. So reforming that has always been quite a challenge. And with a crisis on our doorstep, there's a growing number of voices to reform that tax as well. Which, when I say reform, I mean attempt to do away with and replace that revenue stream with something which leans far less heavily on the economy and on real estate in particular.
Okay. And just lastly, before I move on, you mentioned that housing construction needed to restart. In the UK, we have seen some restarting of that in the last week or so. Has it been completely shut down in Australia?
Yeah, well, I should explain that. So actually, we haven't had a shutdown like has occurred in the UK and in some other places. So construction has been a success story and it's been able to continue going. But so that's great. But particularly when it's come to housing, the demand has fallen off a cliff. So behind this wave of projects that's occurring now, there will be a lot less, and the employment multiplier that represents is really quite immense. You're talking about a mixture of firms from very large firms, property council members, to very, very small subcontractors and suppliers, etc. So there's that's a really strong multiplier. The risk is at the moment that as we get through this period of starting to reopen bits of the economy and then move to a period where we're really trying to get the place going, that's when all our projects finish. And what we've got is our contribution, or that contribution to GDP, is actually winding down really quickly, right at the time where the country is looking for parts of the economy to wind us back up. So we've said, okay, let's really, you're going to need to attack that with a big demand stimulus. So our proposal has been to put some money in the hands of purchasers, make that targeted towards newly constructed housing, and use that as a stimulus to drive growth and activity.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to some of those points. Steve, the view from the US.
Well, the United States is a fairly large country geographically, not quite as big as Canada, and it has a fairly large population. We operate in a federal government with state and local governments. And so the picture across the country varies, although as on this call, it is a reminder that every day of the week, we all deal with similar issues and problems. And in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, all the places represented on the phone have changed their way of life. People working from home, shutdowns of much economic activity, and all that's taken place in the United States as well, of course. One of the differences, I would say, is the way business goes about its business in the context of this crisis, I think, is somewhat different than many of the nations represented on this call, in that, we've gone from the lowest, one of the lowest unemployment rates in American history to one of the highest in a 2-month period. So we have tens of millions of people unemployed, furloughed, separated, whatever the correct term would be. And that is a dramatic change. The economy has been gone from fairly strong and vibrant to recessionary numbers as all this has transpired, and it's had a very significant effect. I would say that we're into maybe the third phase of this crisis. In the earlier part of the year, it was, this is a problem for somewhere else, not really here. then it's a problem that's here, and the economic shutdown took place. And I think we're beginning to get in the phase, as many other places around the globe are, where it is unsustainable to have this degree of cessation of economic activity for this long. And I think people are looking to find a way back to what I guess I would term a new normal or a temporary normal that's a little different from what we've seen the last few months. And in the United States, the real estate landscape has great breadth and depth. So our members are involved in providing the land and structure for all types of economic activity. In every imaginable way, individuals, consumers, all of us use and consume real estate and real estate related services. So when you look at the spectrum of REIT-based real estate investment in the United States, the numbers show interesting commonalities and differences. And so if we look at the FTSE NAREIT US Real Estate Index, and you look at it, what I would call the large cap REITs, the larger REITs by and large, they have performed about 600 basis points worse than the S&P 500 through all this. You're sort of an indicator on the large cap businesses where real estate looks as a sector. But if you compare it with the Dow Jones Industrial Average, large cap US REITs have performed about the same as the Dow Jones through this recent days. And at the same time, the FTSE NAREIT All Equity REIT Index, which covers all equity REITs in the United States, has performed comparably to the Russell 2000, indicative of small cap stocks. What you'll really see is segmentation by sector. And so we have a range, and as Michael notes, I think Canada is seen very similar to the US in terms of these different sectors. If you look at the performance of retail REITs through say yesterday, down about 50% for the year.
Yeah,
the other end of the spectrum, if you look at data center REITs, those real estate companies that are providing the buildings and structure for the cloud for our conversation today, they're up 17% for the year through this crisis.
Yeah.
And it's quite remarkable, what we call in our FTSE NAREIT Index infrastructure REITs, which are mainly the cell phone tower companies providing the ability for us to use our cell phones together with the mobile phone companies. Those are up 8% for the year to date. And so there's a wide swath in the retail area. We've seen in hotel area, it's close to 50%, but there's differentiation to some extent, as Michael Brooks noted about Canada. The malls, in terms of rent collection for April, we're roughly 10 to 20% of rent collected. If you look at the hotel and hospitality and lodging sector, many major hotels have been shut down for weeks now and don't look to reopen for a significant period of time. The hotels that are open are generally generating 10 to 20% of revenue relative to normal times. And yet in the multifamily, the apartment rental space, we're seeing more rent collection in the 90+% range.
Yeah.
These are all April numbers. The May numbers will come in the coming days, and I think there is concern that they can turn worse, including those sectors that have held up pretty well through April, as the consumer, the individual, the small business works to deal with another month of funding fixed costs when there's unemployment, where business has either ceased in terms of economic activity or slowed down considerably. The government has responded with a number of programs we can get into. I'm sure different countries around the world have done different things. There's more to be done, and I'm sure will be done. But I think we're getting to the point where we're sort of entering the next phase, which is to figure out how to reopen safely and in a way to ensure good health for people.
There's some really interesting distinctions there, and we will come back to those, but I just want to bring in Sigrid and Melanie before we get into some of those points. So Sigrid, what's the view from Singapore and of Asia?
Sure, thanks, Damien. As many of you know, Asia comprises of many countries, so we are at different stages, and the challenges that we have come in different forms. If you've been following this part of the world, China and Hong Kong have had some progress in containing the virus. And they're now getting back on their feet and operating at, I would say, around 80 to 90% capacity. Japan, which is our second largest economy in Asia, has declared the state of emergency. But what's interesting is that they are operating like on a hybrid basis, or like semi-open. And the rest of Asia, I would say like India, Singapore, and some of the emerging Southeast Asian countries are in lockdown. And fortunately, you know, we're seeing some improvement as we are now in many places are on extended lockdown. But the reality, as Steve has made reference to a while ago, is that this extended lockdowns comes with a cost. And what we're looking at now in many places is that people and the governments are all working together to gear up for reopening, say in late May for some countries and early June. Here in Singapore, our lockdown ends on the 1st of June, and we're all confident that we'll all be back sometime in June in our offices. So essentially, with Greater China being in operations, we're looking at the progress there and see how we can also model our own economies the way they're doing it. So we've had a number of webinars the last several weeks with our Chinese members, even Indian members, just to see, you know, what's going on. And, you know, to give you a flavor of what they're saying, our landlords in our membership who have started their operations, they have been working through the process of how to operate responsibly and judiciously since April. So the priority, just like what everyone is saying here, is that health and safety are uppermost concerns as people go back to the office and also they resume their social activities. But many are also having to deal with some of the byproduct, the not so nice byproduct of the pandemic, where you have tenants unable to make their rental obligations, as well as having to rationalize their spaces, you know, some of the SMEs, you know, who are unable to keep their space. But the good news is that we're not really looking at massive give backs. So I think we'll have a better sense, you know, over the next couple of months how these things unfold. Now, for investors in our membership, this uncertainty in income that we're seeing on an asset basis. So they're seeing now that some tenants unable to pay. So that's leading to some of repricing of assets. So some of our investor members now are saying that they are experiencing delays, you know, in closing a transaction. So for some, the buyers are thinking that there would be some repricing, so further negotiation in price. At the same time, too, I think the critical one is the travel restrictions that are hampering everyone's ability to conduct site visits. So that's a pretty important one that they have cited. So this is common in China, particularly, you know, in Hong Kong, and I think this is going to be in place for quite some time.
Okay.
Now, yeah, and as a trade group, you know, spanning the region, you know, like what Dominique was saying, you know, we've experienced this because a lot of our members own a significant portion of the commercial space in the gateway markets of Asia Pacific. So what we're doing is that we're working with the various governments to make sure that the packages, the aid packages being prepared, rolled out, will also address the pain points of our stakeholders. And we've had some success, in some markets, the others, obviously we're still waiting for some positive development. Okay,
and as well as repricing of deals, are you seeing deals collapsing as well?
No, I wouldn't say collapsing, but there's just a pause, Damien. People are thinking that, they can still have some leeway, in terms of negotiating the prices, but the thing is this, if you look at the pillars of investment activity, they're still there. As I've mentioned, there are some artificial constraints, like these restrictions and being able to conduct site visits and so on. And then at the same time, people don't know like who's bidding or not, right? There's a pause, but everyone believes that this is just very temporary. A lot of capital is still out there, so it's not like we're going to see a massive price decline, not at all, because if you look at a lot of major markets in Asia, the problem here is that we've always had like a scarcity of assets, for sale, and if they come for and they're up for sale, you pay a steep price. So the fundamentals really haven't really changed. It's just that there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think when we have Singapore opening back in action, you've got, I would say, Japan also more or less, in operation, and other places in Asia being open. I think we're going to see a different tone this time in June, I would say.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Melanie, thank you for your patience. Could you just give a quick overview of the UK? And perhaps I'll move on to the nasty landlord point, that perception that Dominique introduced as well. So if you could respond to both of those, please.
Sure. Thanks, Damien. And a lot of similar themes, I guess, in the UK to what you've heard from other people around the world, unsurprisingly. I guess I might start by sort of a reflection that I think, even as we sort of started to hear about what was happening initially in China and then in a lot of the countries that Sigrid talked about, I don't think there was really an understanding quite of how significant the impact was going to be, how widespread it was going to be, and therefore what the response would need to be. So I think when our government came to act, and you have to give, I think, our government huge credit for the speed at which it acted and the significance of the interventions it's made. But I think that looking back, they were probably from a mindset that thought this was quite a short-term crisis and shock we'd have to deal with. So they understandably and rightly focused their grant support on supporting individual household incomes, on supporting small businesses and consumer-facing businesses in particular, recognising retail, hospitality and leisure, as others have talked about, would be at the sharp end of this. And no one could criticise that. But I think against the background where it was thought this was about giving them breathing space, this was about a short-term liquidity crash, and we just needed to get through that, rather than where I think we actually now are, which is a long haul through an uncertain next phase, because we're not kind of having a crisis and recovering from it. We are moving from one phase to another phase of a yet uncertain journey, and that's a long haul. And it requires people to work together collaboratively, whereas I think short-term interventions that are just designed to get the most vulnerable through a short period, tend to kind of be fairly ruthless about not worrying very much about where the pain of that's going to fall. And clearly, the property sector was seen in general terms as a sector that could bear an amount of short-term pain, where other sectors were less able to do that. So what that's driven is a kind of an environment, I think, where it's become antagonistic as opposed to collaborative, because interests have been damaged, and the property sector has undoubtedly been singled out as a sector that's has its interests mitigated against by the government. And I think that's really unfortunate, because actually what we desperately need is a collaborative approach that says we're all in this together for the long haul, and we need to figure out a way of coming through it together. And it's not, to Dominique's point, it's not just a liquidity issue, actually. Yeah. It's a fundamental rebuilding of the global economy, and no one sector can bear the pain of that or do that in isolation. And so I think, reflecting, I think that's unfortunate. It's understandable how we got to there, but I think it's extremely unfortunate that that's the position we're now in, and there's now a certain amount of rowing back from that and rebuilding of that and resetting of that dial that's going to need to happen. And nasty landlords will be absolutely the centre of that, because we underpin everything that people do, and whatever the new normal is and over what period it is that we find out to what extent the changes of behaviour that we're all adopting to become sticking and change the need for the built environment in the future. The built environment will underpin them all one way or another, whether it's our homes, our workplaces, our leisure spaces and so on. So you can't escape property owners and landlords in the solution to this, as well as the travelling through it. And of course, the kind of caricature that we still see perpetuated in the media and in conversations, around large, well-capitalised individuals driving smart cars, wearing smart clothes, and all that kind of thing. Damien, you're very well placed to know, the Estates Gazette, has been an absolute champion of kind of getting behind that myth and working out who really does own our high streets, our built environment. And you published the Estates Gazette data last week, I think, looking at retail specifically, that shows that, overwhelmingly it's the public that own retail real estate, whether it's local authorities, whether it's direct investment from pension funds and investment funds and saving funds, or even indirectly through the shares they buy in REITs and other listed companies. So this is our futures, and we have as much stake in the health of the built environment and the property sector as we do in the future of, the other businesses that are very much more directly getting support. The other reflection I'd make against that background of sort of short versus long-term strategy is that, most of the government grant has gone in terms of supporting individuals and individual incomes. Which is sustainable over a short period, but hellish expensive for the longer term. And I think figuring out how the government's going to escape from that income support that they've been giving to individuals and how they're going to have a glide path out of that is one of the huge challenges they face. Most of the support that's gone into business has been in the form of loans. And one of the reasons why, and we'll come on, I know, to talk about it, we proposed the furloughed space grant scheme is that, for a large part of the property ecosystem, that's not really a viable solution, whether it's because, the tenant and they're just building up debts they'll never be able to repay back over a meaningful period of time, or whether it's because of the gearing that already exists within the property sector that means that adding the option for unsecured loans on top of secured loans in existing deals isn't really a viable option. So again, I think there's some challenges there that we're going to have to rethink in the context of a long-term haul and recovery plan, as opposed to a sort of short-term crisis management scenario.
Yeah, and that EG radius data was interesting in how it tried to paint a very different picture to the common perception. And it was a message you took into Parliament virtually last week, Melanie, as well. I suppose my fear, though, is that we came into this crisis with that nasty landlord perception, and we have seen plenty of landlords do good supportive things from around the world, as every speaker on the call just pointed to. Yet, certainly in the UK, it seems to have become more embedded, not less. So I wonder how we'll come out of this. I wonder if we'll come out of it worse reputationally rather than better or even neutral.
I am one of those who believes that, people will look back and remember how we all behaved during this period, whether it's as individuals, whether it's as businesses, and I think I see, just as others have talked about on the call, in the UK, I see so many examples of where property companies are supporting the NHS, are supporting communities, whether through volunteering or directly through making their spaces available in the kinds of ways people have talked about. I see so many examples of large property companies supporting small tenants, that I have to believe that counts and that matters, and that we will be judged by that, and that will be remembered going forward. I have no truck with bad practice by landlords any more than I do bad practice by, the kind of well-capitalised tenants that are outraging many of our members and that Dominique talked about. I think we have to be prepared to call out bad behaviour wherever we see it. But equally, I think we should celebrate and champion good behaviour, and I see so many examples of that.
Okay, thank you. Steve, I was struck by the distinctions you drew between sectors in the US, and there's a broader base there, of course, and perhaps a broader understanding as well. But do you think we'll emerge in the US with a deeper understanding of real estate, where the challenges are, where the opportunities are, where the good guys are, and where the bad guys are?
Well, you know, I do believe that this crisis will have both temporary and more permanent ramifications in terms of the use of real estate in our society, how real estate's operated, and potentially how it is financed and owned. And you know, what we do know is our community around the world provides, as I said, the land and structure for business to conduct its business and for us all to lead our lives. And, you know, that land generally is put to the highest and best use in our economies. And that highest and best use changes over time. It changes with technological innovation. It changes with population movement. It changes. It may change slowly, and sometimes it changes quite quickly. And you know, we've been living in the midst of those changes. Just if you start thinking about the different sectors I talked about in terms of data centers or infrastructure or retail, for that matter, in terms of the changes afoot. I think that will be accelerated and hastened. As companies look and as the businesses, our tenants, look to reopen, how they use real estate, how the real estate's maintained, all will come into question in terms of protocols for indoor air, for sanitation, for a variety of things people are looking at now. And I think the same will be true in terms of how real estate is financed. Real estate has, you know, generally taken on more leverage for a lot of reasons relative to other business operations. I think a crisis like this, not unlike the great financial crisis we all lived through not too long ago, will once again underline what is the appropriate balance between debt and equity in operating in an economy that may be subject to risks. One thing to keep in mind is that real estate is a long-lived asset. It has economic earning power over an extended period of time. And I think we'll see the durability of that through this crisis as nations reopen and economies recover, albeit slowly. By and large, the value embedded in that real estate as we return to a new normal will be sustained and is sustainable, although some uses of real estate at the margin will no doubt change as we accept that trends that were underway before may get accelerated through this crisis as we all learn to work a little bit more from home. And as we may be more reticent, at least for a period of time, to travel or travel great distances. But my expectation is I have faith in the resilience of humanity, the ingenuity of individuals, and the desire to be with each other face to face in the flesh and not just on the glass screen.
Yeah, I think
so
that's
we'll be back.
I'm glad the audience has worked out that you can submit questions without me prompting you. So thank you for that. And Dominique, I'll build on what Steve was saying there and bring in a question from Philip Charles. To what extent will the broad experience with working from home change the demand for offices, particularly for big financial institutions, law firms, etc.? Of course, we all desire to be with people again. Do you think it will go back to that wholeheartedly, or we'll find a new balance?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer that, of course, the behavior of most people will change a little bit. But as Steve correctly mentioned, and you just repeated that, I would say personally, I miss to see my team on a daily basis. I miss to meet the members. I want to meet them. We want to be together, etc. That's the beauty also of the real estate sector. So of course, it will have an impact, but everybody will still need, I would say, to have places to meet, places to work, places to live, etc. There were also very interesting articles over the last weeks coming especially from the big bankers saying that having huge office buildings in very expensive cities with thousands of bankers might be a thing of the past. This could partially be true, but on the other side, I would say people will still need to go to the office. So there, I think there will be a balance because there is also, I would say, huge debate. Okay, what's the future of the co-working? Because what we are experiencing right now is that the co-working areas are more or less empty, etc. Co-working will also be, I would say, a good balance to, I would say, the permanent offices we are renting. Retail for me is very important because we all know that the retail sector has been heavily under pressure over the last years. I can tell you that speaking aloud, I've got a teenager here. The first thing she's expecting is to be next Monday, the 11th, because the shops will be open in Belgium. She wants to be back. I would say she wants to go back to a shop. She wants to meet people, etc. I told her it will not be the right day to do it because it will be the first one. She understands us perfectly. And it's not even because it's owned by one of our members that I mentioned that, but people need to go out, etc. So it will never replace. So everybody has been stuck home for almost 2 months right now. I would say everybody wants to go out, etc., which definitely confirms that the appetite for real estate will definitely be there, but the way we will be using it will be different. I never expected, even at the beginning of February, that I would be working 2 months from home and using a part of my house as an office space. I never expect that, so I can accommodate with it, but I think this is not the norm. Something which is also interesting when we see right now, I mentioned briefly about the mobility at the very beginning, but also the huge phenomenon of urbanization. There is in Europe, in many countries, a big trend towards urbanization. At the same time, what have we seen in many European countries? The day before the lockdown measures were put in place, you had a lot of people leaving the cities to go back to their secondary residences where they have more space, where they have a garden, where they can let the kids go outside, etc. So urbanization was a big theme. Everybody said this is what's going to happen. But on the other side, what we are experiencing for the time being also pushes some people to say, is it the right place to live, or should we just go to the city to work and stay outside? So of course, this whole crisis, because we all live it on a daily basis, this is life. This is very concrete. I think it will bring some, I would say, answers to the questions we've been having over the last years. Yeah.
We might have to set aside another hour for urbanisation versus rural, rural living. And I do like the idea of you persuading your teenager to go to one of your members' malls.
It's important. It's important. And it's not
but
because
Michael, can I bring you in on this working from home versus office debate? Because it's not just the being there, it's the getting there as well. And transport systems will have to adjust too.
Yeah, that's a big issue. That's a huge issue. While if you storyboarded your return to work, live in the suburbs, work in the downtown, the touch points you have with other people until there's a vaccine that everybody has taken is overwhelming. And the fear that people will continue to have, I believe, will be pervasive for quite a period of time. In my staff, my young millennials who live downtown, they're going to walk to work, they're fine. Anybody who's taking the subway or a train is very nervous. And I've already said to my staff, everybody, optional full-time work from home until the end of the year. I could never have imagined myself saying that 2 months ago. But for all of us, we have all advanced 5 years in digital progress in 7 weeks. Probably many of us never used Zoom 8 weeks ago. We never used WebEx. We would never think of being on this kind of an event 7 weeks ago. We're all now enabled to work from home. So the transit piece becomes, you know what, if I don't have to go to work, I really don't want to. And so to Dominique's point, I think we'll see offices change quite a bit. I could see half the people now going to work, and I could see offices doubling the space per employee going forward to have physical distance. And it might end up being an offset. And in my case, when I go to the office, you know what? I'm probably going to drive now. And I haven't driven to the office in 5 years. So there are a bunch of changes happening on the urban-suburban front, Damien, I think as well.
Okay, really interesting stuff. And Sigrid, another question that's come in. Do you think your members will introduce fundamentally new resilience measures into their development and investment strategies moving forward? Those risk considerations and risk profiling must be changing in ways we don't even fully understand yet.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, just looking at on an asset basis, Damon, just to talk about also this work from home phenomenon and so on. Keep in mind in Asia, we've got this high density open floor plan that is so ubiquitous, pretty much in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, in a lot of high cost locations. And the primary driver of that is cost. And so this is going to be interesting to Michael's point about having to look at how our landlords will have to look at the configuration, because in China as well, some of our landlord members are looking at some of these office configurations, because clearly this is an important matter that's playing out in very expensive locations. So we can expect some changes there, but to Steve's point about the demographics, okay, real estate at the end of the day is driven by the underpinnings of our economy. So Asia today, if you look at all our players, no one is saying I'm throwing in the towel, okay? Everyone is fully invested in Asia. Why? Because growth is gonna be the highest still in this part of the world. Our demographics in many emerging locations are still the most favorable. So in fact, one of the things that, I thought what was interesting as an opportunity in some of the emerging locations. So in India, for example, we have been in discussions with some of our landlord members that they are getting some, they're talking now to a lot of global multinationals who are looking to decentralize further their operations into Asia because of this extended lockdowns in many places. And so what they would like to do is to explore some of these emerging locations that are still very cost effective. So this is not happening only in India, but also in emerging ASEAN countries like, Vietnam, the Philippines. So they're going to be a beneficiary of this and as outsourcing destinations for the region. So as a trade group, for real estate, what we're looking at is how we can help the government put into place some policies that will eradicate, the barriers to foreign direct investments, that will allow them to set foot and expand their footprint in some of these emerging locations that can give them, the options that they're looking at. So there are some opportunities and also just on the residential front, which is interesting because some of our residential developers are now, in Asia today, if you look at many of the residences, we're not equipped to have home offices. This is the reason why Japan has been semi-open, because a lot of the apartments are tight quarters. They can't afford to have all of this home office kind of option. So what people are talking about is how are the designs going to be changing, in terms of the residential. And I think we're going to see that pretty much in many places, because today we're just not equipped to do that in major markets in Asia. So that's on a trend basis. So from an investment standpoint, as I said, it's like the same thing. pre-COVID, no one is throwing in the towel. People are still betting into Asia, but then again, you know, assets, the question is what assets will be out there available, you know, for sale.
Okay. Melanie, there's another question that's come in on risk, building on that resilience point I raised earlier. Do you think there will be a different approach? One listener asked whether risk transfer is an important theme across real estate and transactions as well as construction. Do you see the approach changing, potentially risk sharing between clients and contractors, perhaps tenants and landlords even?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying right at the start, is that we're going to have a more collaborative and a more, dare I say, grown-up approach to this going forward. And I think, you know, for me, a big part of that's going to be across the public and private sectors, as well as within existing commercial relationships and redefining those, because, you know, governments have had to throw all the money they didn't have at this crisis already, you know, so a lot of the investment that's going to be needed to, you know, carry out the agenda that was there, you know, so it's not very many weeks ago that, you know, Boris Johnson was elected with a huge majority on a levelling up agenda, which was all about investment in regeneration of our town and city centres. You know, that agenda hasn't gone away, and indeed, you know, there'll be new inequalities, I suspect, as well as potentially the exacerbation of some of the existing inequalities that existed that the government's determined to tackle. So that investment is going to come from the private sector, but it's going to have to be in partnership with the public sector to create the right framework and strategy and relationships to deliver that. So I think it will challenge us really hard, actually, to create new ways of collaborative working that are in everybody's interests for the long term. And Steve made the really important point, you know, that we take a long-term view as a sector, as an industry, and that's going to be more than ever necessary, I think.
Yeah. And Ken, there's a specific question that's come in for you, and I've got a general one. I wonder, and it was just touched on a moment ago, I wonder whether this crisis will accelerate tech adoption and changes the way we use, measure and design buildings. If you could take that question. And also someone asked, how has the Australian Code of Conduct landed with landlords and tenants?
Well, take the tech question. I mean, thank goodness we've got all the tech that we're using at the moment, because otherwise we, you know, business really would have ground to a halt. So it's been fortunate that we're enabled to actually continue a lot of business in the way that we have. But it goes to buildings. You know, I think Steve touched on it earlier. You know, I think the longer that we have this virus with us, and, you know, people are talking 12 or 18 months before there's a vaccine. So as we live with this virus, that will have profound effects on our behaviour, I think, while it's on. If you think of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, that health and security is right up towards the top. And so that will colour a lot of things. So the longer we have this, which is expected to be some time, you know, that will shape things. So people will want to have want to feel safe at work, and they want to feel safe when they're going shopping, and they want to feel safe when they're going to a hotel, and indeed they want to feel safe as they're moving around a city. So design will need to respond to that, and technology will need to respond to that. And there's you know, the whole wellness focus that we're increasingly seeing, I think, will probably get a kick along here. You know, there's, you know, ensuring that there is, you know, there'll be companies who'll be prepared to pay more for really amazing quality air. In Australia, we had, you know, the bushfire event, which many of you would have seen on TV, which obviously wasn't raging through the middle of our cities, but the pollution that occurred in Australia, you know, maybe if you're in Beijing or something, you're used to that level of pollution, but it was phenomenal. It was completely phenomenal. It was like you know, a London pea super or something, but the wrong colour. So it was completely phenomenal, and I think, you know, that's in people's psyche as well. These two phenomenal events affecting Australia. So I think there'll be a big spur along around wellness, technological responses, resilience. So, you know, and that will accentuate the longer we have this virus with us. To the question around the Code of Conduct, and we've got an email from one of Melanie's colleagues today. Actually, I understand the UK is looking at the Australian code of conduct. So, and there was discussions, and I
At
think
the headline level,
spoken
could you
about.
just describe it, Ken, as well, please?
Yeah. So you know, in Australia, the national cabinet, our federal government, our state and territory governments leaders have come together in a national cabinet, which has been overwhelmingly a good idea. But our national cabinets announced that a code of conduct for the way that landlords and tenants, or landlords and small business tenants who have experienced a significant loss in their turnover should negotiate around their activities. So, for example, it actually sets out a formula for rent relief. So it says that you must provide rent relief for an eligible tenant in proportion to the loss of turnover, and 50% of that 50% of that rent relief needs to be by way of rent waiver, right? So rent free, and the others can be deferment or etc. So it's quite an impact, so for a landlord, that's not just a cash flow hit. That's a real hit. Yeah. That money's never coming back. And that's hardwired in for those eligible small to medium businesses have experienced at least a 30% loss in income. So it's quite significant. And, of course, on the banks, the banks have announced arrangements where they will defer their interest, but again, they're not waiving interest. So there's this squeeze that's occurring here where, property companies are not just having a cash flow hit, but they're actually losing real income. And on the other side of them, their financiers, whether they be Australian banks or foreign banks operating in Australia, if they've got, bond debt instruments offshore, etc., they're not getting that same deal for that. So there's a bit of a squeeze on here, which is I think policymakers underrate. Interestingly, our Reserve Bank has pointed to this, and they've looked back in history and reminded themselves of the financial instability that can come ricocheting out of the commercial property markets, and have said that, look, we've got to be careful here. We've got to look to what's happening in the commercial property sector. They're a very important part of the economy. And if things go wrong in there, then that can ricochet out into the financial system. So, my advice to Melanie and our UK colleagues would be, there's more than a few problems with the Australian code that's been adopted, and certainly some kick-on impacts.
Okay, thank you. We're just about out of time, but in the last few minutes, I'd just like to go around the group really, and just now is your opportunity. We've got plenty of people listening today. They may well be in government, in each of your governments. What would you like them to do? What is going to provide the best safety net to the real estate industry? Every industry will be asking themselves that question, of course. But we're dealing with real estate. So Sigrid, can I start with you?
Sure. I think it would be good as we, a lot of the governments, in India, in Hong Kong, here in Singapore, we've had experience, a significant pain in real estate, and we would like to make sure that all of their aid packages address these pain points, in terms of the rent relief that they're giving out to tenants, because that also has significant impact on the cash flow of the landlords. And also there are, we need to look at also the big picture, and make sure that these packages address the stakeholders of our industry. We, as everyone knows, real estate accounts for a significant portion of the economy of many, across pretty much around the world. In Asia Pacific, our estimate is that it could be around 30 to 40% of GDP. That's pretty significant. So it is very important that the government also looks at our stakeholders, to make sure that we are able to get back on our feet, operate responsibly and judiciously as we reopen our economies, in the next few weeks on a staggered basis across Asia. And the other thing too that I would like to emphasize is that there would be opportunities, particularly for the emerging locations, where we can still look at some of our policies that will allow foreign direct investments to come into our region. So looking at our FDI policies in many places, let's make our countries much more open for business, business friendly to everyone. So that's one of the things that we're focusing on in this year as well, to make sure that as we transition into a recovery, that many of our countries are able to work alongside the government, because we need them to kickstart growth, particularly in the hard-hit countries, the emerging locations. We need them. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Michael.
Well, we've been advocating for a rent bank approach, like some of the others have mentioned. We've been concerned about crisis-free riders. Dominic mentioned the multinationals in Europe. We've seen that in retail. We've even seen that in offices, people trying to take advantage of the crisis to obtain a rent reduction. So I think that making sure there's a filter on the tenant side helps. And I think that's the primary area. Maybe a secondary area, and it's an area that hasn't been hit very hard economically, but has been hit very hard in terms of death rate, has been the seniors community, senior long-term care housing. It's where a large percentage of our deaths have occurred. And it's revealed flaws in some of the premises that are undermanaged. And so we need another regulatory regime around those most vulnerable, that sector of the economy. And I'm waiting for some more legislative support in that area. That's it.
Absolutely. Okay, Dominique.
Yeah, I would say, so what we have seen in many countries is that some measures which had been pushed by the governments were more to put more constraints on the landlord instead of bringing support to the tenants. So, and I'm very supportive of what Melanie said earlier. So we need to have a collaborative approach or a joint effort by the tenants, the landlords, the governments, and the banks and the lenders. We have some good examples in Europe. Look at Sweden, where the government has put in place very good measures to help and to bring with a solution which start being applicable on the 1st of July. This is a very good scheme where the government will also supply 25% of the expected rent. Look at the Netherlands, the traditional pragmatic Dutch approach, where they could find a good solution between the lenders and the retail landlords, etc. So we have some examples in some European countries where this can be achieved. And I think my key take is, guys, let's put in place something where everybody brings something to the party, and let's start putting all the pressure on the landlords' shoulders.
Okay, thank you. Steve.
Yes, in the United States, the federal government has taken extraordinary steps to date, and more are expected. Some weeks ago, the U.S. Congress passed the CARES Act, which provided, in earlier incarnation, extended unemployment benefits, given the unemployment growth that was forecasted and came to be. It also effectively created a program for small businesses to be able to meet their payroll obligations if they brought back workers, turned that into forgivable loans, and stood up facilities to the U.S. Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, of up to $6 trillion in lending power, which is only just beginning. So extraordinary efforts. That being said, the scale of the problem and the duration of the problem is greater than everyone imagined, I think, a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And so we expect there to be a continued push for more. And I will say that when you look at the convergence of what's practical, what's politically acceptable, and the right sort of policy course, I think from a U.S. perspective, more needs to be done to make sure that stream of commerce that Ken and Dominique and others have talked about is not unduly interrupted and compromised in this process. And I think that the most practical way to ensure that stream of commerce continues uninterrupted without being so compromised it impedes economic recovery, is we need to come up with more efficient and effective ways to get funds to the small and medium-sized businesses. So not only can they maintain their payrolls and get back on their feet, but they can pay their other fixed costs, rent, so the landlord can pay property taxes. If that is cut off, it only weakens the foundation for everyone. And so I'm in accord with others who mentioned it's very important to begin for government policy to determine how to bring in some support for rent collection, because that rent doesn't stay with the landlord. Most of it goes out to local governments in the United States, goes out to lenders, goes out to utilities, and other parties. And so if that is interrupted or compromised, it weakens the entire system. And we're hopeful additional programs will be developed to support that stream of commerce, and we support it. And one other point I will make, and it was related to a question with the risk transfer, is I do believe this crisis will cause a rethinking in every contract, in every lease agreement, in every financing agreement, who bears the risk of loss from whether it's a pandemic or what I will call more generically a government-imposed shutdown of economic activity. This will be something top of mind as new leases are entered into, as new loans take place in the later this year and into next year. And it is a significant problem to be addressed. And governments around the world may need to provide some guidance in terms of the next time there's a shutdown, if it's pandemic or other related, in terms of how the economy might be backstopped more effectively and efficiently in the future.
Yeah, I'm sure. And Melanie, lastly with you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's already been said, and I think Ken's point around the extent to which the health of the commercial property sector and the financial economy and health generally are interlinked is really critical, and that's the kind of, as we hopefully move to more strategic approach and not a crisis management approach, I think that will be critical to keep reminding governments and our stakeholders of. The other thing I'd say is, as we think about that more strategic approach, that long-term collaborative approach, let's not forget the burning platform we were already standing on around sustainability and climate change. And let's build those, you know, let's not just put that on the back burner again because something more important, urgent's come along. We have to build, sustain our contribution to cutting carbon emissions and to a more sustainable global future into our recovery plans.
Indeed.
Okay, we've overrun, I'm afraid, but plenty of good stuff there, and a good point from Melanie at the end, that this isn't the end of the challenges facing society and real estate. So I think there was a collective message around collaboration there, around risk management, around prioritising those tenants who need help, not necessarily tenants just because they're tenants, and also stopping viewing landlords as an easy target, because there are repercussions if that is the policy that's pursued. So thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us at every part of the working day there and well beyond. So thanks again.